This is a massive day because we're going to talk about the DRUMEO documentary that just dropped, or if you've watched it last week when it dropped to the DRUMEO members, that's great. If you haven't seen it yet, you got to go to the DRUMEO YouTube channel. I'll provide a link down below for you. But this is to talk about everything that we just witnessed, which I'm pretty sure is probably the biggest piece of Phil Collins content that we have seen, maybe even ever. Honestly, the amount of on screen, because if it's a Genesis documentary, there's all the other guys. If it is a Phil documentary, there may be a little bit shorter or it's about one subject. This is all about Phil, all about drumming, Genesis as well. And I think it might be literally the most on camera we have of Phil Collins in one sitting. It's incredible. Let's talk about it. First, let's give a shout out to DRUMEO. What is DRUMEO? Well, honestly, I didn't know as of 2 years ago. When Nick Collins started doing these videos with DRUMEO, I wasn't familiar with them. They're basically an online educational platform for drummers, people just who are wanting to learn how to play drums or improve. And they've grown over the years from being just a basic YouTube channel to actually being like this massive membership only platform where they have celebrity drummers come in and teach certain things at all different levels. It's incredible. I've been a member for a little while. It really is an incredible tool. And it's a no-brainer that they would partner with Nick and a no-brainer that they would feature Phil Collins. Let me personally take you back and why this is so special to me. I had just come off of the kind of the craze and the excitement of the last Domino tour. I had just started this channel back in 2022. In the fall of 2022, I believe I'm getting my timeline right here. In the fall of 2022 is when Nick first appeared on DRUMEO, teaching people some of the drum fills from the Genesis and from Phil Collins tours that he had just done, and showcasing his relationship with his dad and his knowledge of Phil's drumming. Now, for me personally, I was a drummer only because of Phil Collins back when I was like 3 or 4 years old. I had a bunch of toy drum kits and then some decent drum kits, like beginner drum kits. But then around sometime just before high school, when I picked up an acoustic guitar and realized you could take that to campfires and it was kind of easier to get girls and you could write your own songs, I shifted over to guitar and I stopped playing drums probably around 12 or 13. And I met other drummers who were way better than me. And I just kind of got discouraged and I completely stopped playing. Fast forward some 20, 30 years. And I was watching this DRUMEO stuff and I was just obsessed with drumming and remembering that feeling of like, man, a drum kit. First of all, a drum kit looks so cool. It has so many parts. And so at the end of 2022, I had watched all of these Nick Collins interviews on DRUMEO, and I decided to buy myself a drum kit for Christmas, which is a little bit of a midlife crisis. And there it is back there. Can you see it? See it because my microphone. It's like a vintage 50s, 60s Premiere kit. Very beautiful. And some crappy cymbals. A fairly decent snare, and some rototoms I bought because I'm a goofball, and it's like my second midlife crisis, and they sound ridiculously hilarious. But back in the holidays of 2022, after I'd watched all of this incredible Phil Collins footage, or Nick Collins footage, I should say, talking about the drums, I was like, I need to get a drum kit. So I bought myself a drum kit, and I committed to playing drums every single day. So that is the end of 2022, and we're now at the end of 2024. 2 years later, I have played drums or practice pad of some sort every single day. I'm actually pretty decent now. It's like pretty cool. I will say the first day on Christmas morning, I came up here and started playing, and I played along in my headphones to all of the Phil Collins and Genesis songs in one day. And I was super discouraged for two reasons. One, I suck at drums. Two, Phil Collins drumming is really, really hard. It's not a good place to start if you're a new drummer. Anyway, that's just a little personal thank you to DRUMEO because it got me back into drums. And I play drums every day and it's fun. Now, in 2023, I believe it was, early 2023, DRUMEO on their social media were talking about flying to Switzerland, meeting Phil Collins. You saw those iconic photos of Phil looking great, sitting in a chair in a castle, talking about drumming with Nick. And there was this thought of, okay, DRUMEO's going to do this little vignette, this little featurette of Phil Collins about his drumming, interviewed by Nick. How great is this? This could be really cool. That was early 2023. All of 2023 went by and we hadn't seen anything. There was rumors that it didn't go well. There was all sorts of things going on. All of 2024 almost all of 2024 had gone by. Brandon from Drumeo had said that there was still something coming, but it was mysterious. Why did this take so long? Well, I think naively we were thinking this would be just maybe a 15-minute little feature with Phil Collins. What we didn't know is that they're actually putting together a 2-hour documentary, like an original documentary. And there's some complications with this documentary, which I'll talk about in a second. I think naively, a lot of us were just thinking it would be like a little mini interview. In fact, even when I watched the live premiere last week, I didn't know it was a 2-hour documentary. I was like, it was like 10 o'clock at night, and I'm just about to watch a 15-minute feature, not realizing I'm hunkering down for 2 hours, which was a very pleasant surprise. But now all of a sudden it makes sense. Okay, this is why it would take 2 years or more to put this together. We know there's some other delays too, and this is really interesting. In fact, they did a live stream where Brandon and Nick Collins gave some background info on how this all came together. In fact, apparently at Drumeo, many years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, somebody else at Drumeo had reached out to Tony Smith about doing some sort of feature on Phil Collins, and it didn't really go anywhere, partly because Drumeo is a really small channel. Now they have millions of subscribers. They've worked with some of the biggest and best drummers in the world. They're putting a huge emphasis on content. A lot of their videos and social media content gets millions and millions of views. So they're now very, very big. And so back then it would make sense that they were just not maybe ready to put together a big piece. And so now they were. So that's an interesting little backstory that we learned. So the question was, why did this documentary take 2 years to put together? Well, first of all, now that we know it's a 2-hour documentary, having a documentary be filmed and edited and then prepped for release, 2 years is not a long time at all. If you're making a big documentary, if you're making a film, that's normally how long these big things take. If you're writing a book, it should take 1 to 2 years. That's no big deal. So now that we know it's a big documentary, the timeline is not worrisome at all. It absolutely makes sense. And also you have to schedule the release, right? You want to plan to release this at a good time. If you do it during the summer or just before the summer, you're going to miss out on a captive audience, as opposed to now dropping it just before Christmas, where people are really hungry for content. So it made a lot of sense now looking back. Okay, 2 years, it's not a big deal. Why were we pestering Drumeo for this content? There's also parties. We know that Tony and Phil have always been very particular about the content they release. So there's lots of parties involved that need to approve this process. Here's the biggest piece of the story, and what really Brandon led on to affecting the documentary, and that was the use of music, Genesis music and Phil Collins music. You see, it doesn't matter like if you're highlighting someone or giving someone exposure, or the fact that using their tracks may reflect positively on their catalog on Spotify. Nobody really cares about that. If you're using music and film, if you're syncing music and film, you have to pay for the sync fee and the publishing fee to whoever owns the track. So let's rewind to early 2023. There's a possibility that this maybe started getting underway, or even late 2022, before or just around the time of the Concord deal. So it's possible that Phil and Tony could have authorized the use in this documentary for either for a low fee or for no fee at all if they own the rights, and they thought that this was like a fair use case of using Phil's and Genesis music, potentially. Because if you're filming a 2-hour documentary and you're talking about every single song, you want to play a clip of that song. So if you're talking about Down and Out and how complicated the drumming is to Down and Out, you want to hear Down and Out in the background, or the In the Air Tonight, Phil. One of the biggest delays and what had them recut this whole movie a couple times was the fact that they were either not able to use some of the music, or the music became so expensive that they couldn't afford it or they couldn't justify it. And again, Phil and Genesis music, when you're talking about big hits like Invisible Touch, or Follow You, Follow Me, or the Disney stuff, Sue Studio, In the Air Tonight, those are all very, very big songs. And so if you're syncing all of those in a 2-hour documentary, that could cost a lot of money. You would hope that there's some sort of bulk negotiation. My theory, this wasn't mentioned, the C word wasn't mentioned at all in the documentary, but my theory is that Concord was involved, and that Concord is protecting this massive asset that they just purchased, and that it's more valuable to license stuff to ESPN Monday Night Football, or to big movies like The Hangover than it is for little drumming documentaries like this that have a distribution just on YouTube. So my theory is that Concord got involved. and that made things just a little bit too cost prohibitive. That's my guess. That wasn't said, but what was said was that using the songs or not using the songs made them have to rescript, re-edit, recut the film. Because if you have all of this space that's filled up with the actual music, that takes away from needing to edit Phil or Nick's dialogue. But without that, you're left with using just stock music, and you're left with using some of the drum parts played by Nick, which is really cool because I don't think there's like publishing on a drum beat or a drum fill, and the mechanical rights, or sorry, the recording rights is whoever recorded that performance. So it would have been the session musician, which is Nick, and he would have been paid or compensated, however. And then the master recording would be owned by DRUMEO, and so they could actually use the "In the Air Tonight" fill by Nick playing it without involving anyone else, which is cool. And they did that. I think they actually could have done that more, in my opinion. Okay, so that's the whole process, is why this took so long. So basically, this is a documentary that features an interview between Nick and Phil that talks about the history of him drumming, but it also has a lot of interstitials, a lot of talking heads from various drummers all over the world. I would say that it's a slight complaint of mine, only because I'm a huge Phil fan, and there's some drummers that I don't know, and there was a lot of talking heads. And yeah, I know that Phil's a great drummer, and we know that the "In the Air Tonight" Phil is iconic. So to hear that said over and over by millions of drummers, I just felt like the documentary could have almost been shorter. Having said that, when you see a drummer that you admire, Glenn Koch from Wilco is my second favorite drummer in the world. To see him in this documentary meant a ton to me. So if you're a drummer and you see your favorite drummer, and if your favorite drummer is not this massive iconic drummer, but is a lesser known drummer, and you see him talking about Phil, then that's meaningful for you. So that's kind of why they needed to include so many clips of other drummers speaking to Phil's greatness. So I get that there was a ton of them. I would have loved more screen time by Phil, but there was a ton of screen time from Phil. There was this one magical moment, because one of the big questions from a lot of you will be, was there anything that we learned in this documentary that we didn't know? I would say for diehard Genesis and Phil fans, probably not a ton. There was some really magical moments between Nick and Phil, which I think is the highlight of the documentary. However, there was this like accusation by Nick that the which honestly sped by me so fast. I need to go back and watch it again. If you've watched it, let me know. But there was this comment by Nick that perhaps the "In the Air Tonight" Phil was foreshadowed somewhere on Seconds Out. I want to think maybe it was Los Endos. I'm not sure what he was referring to because they couldn't use a clip. So I need to go back and watch that DRUMEO clip. That the kind of the da 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 is played on a song somewhere by Phil or by Chester or Bill maybe on Seconds Out, and he showed that to Phil that it may have been a subconscious foreshadow of the "In the Air Tonight" Phil, or just some ironic coincidence. And Phil thought that was really interesting. Another great little bit was how do you play the "In the Air Tonight" Phil? Where do you put the kicks in between the toms, the floor toms? Two different versions. And Phil, I mean, I could have watched that for hours of just Phil and Nick interacting. In fact, there's more videos to come. If you are subscribed to DRUMEO's YouTube channel, there's actually going to be a lot more raw footage, just nonstop talking between Phil and Nick, which is great because the documentary is cut really well. The cinematography, I'll just say, I'm all over the place here, but the cinematography, I'll show you a clip, is unbelievable. I mean, I just thought they went over there with a couple iPhones to chat with Phil. No. This is like a beautifully shot documentary. I mean, his drums look incredible. Phil looks incredible. The castle looks incredible. Anyway, apparently there's more footage of just like raw footage of Phil and Nick just chatting about all the songs over the years. Very, very cool. When it comes to learning new things, another interesting thing was in the preamble before the documentary aired. One of the fans asked, what's Phil doing right now? Is he making more music potentially? Nick said that he's enjoying his retirement. Nick said that retirement kind of came difficult to Phil, that he didn't really know what to do with his time. He's been watching a lot of soccer, football. There's no plans to make new music. He does have a studio at home. He doesn't even listen to music. Occasionally he'll listen to The Who or Bruce Hornsby, but it's rare to see Phil listen to music. That's not as strange as it sounds because I know a lot of musicians who actually don't listen to music for whatever reason. It's kind of weird. But I also know that as you get older, I feel like you just don't want to try new things. And I find that even I'm much younger than Phil. But now I often 90% of what I listen to is stuff that I know I love. And I really just don't care to explore new things. And I would say only 10% of my music listening time is to listen to new things. I mostly now listen to comforting music, nostalgic music. So I kind of get the fact you just get older, but I will say that like Nick left the door open. He said that like he's not like sometimes he dabbles, but like sometimes he's at the piano. There is an opening for him to write new music or to release new music. I think it was someone online or in the documentary that said like one of the reasons why we'll never hear new Phil music is because he's such a perfectionist that like he would listen back to it and know that it's nowhere near what he used to do. Um, or used to be able to do. And therefore, because it's not as good as his previous catalog, that he wouldn't release that, And I guess the only hope there would be if there's any older demos that never saw the light of day that has his younger voice. Anyway, there's another video of Nick building the drums from scratch in completion. So having the drums from the 92 tour, I think it was, or maybe the 2007 tour, the black ones, the concert toms and everything, to pull them out of the box and build them from scratch. So if you're a drum fan, that's a video that'll be coming out. An hour long uncut interview with Nick and Phil, which will be cool. And then I think there's more. Nick is doing a DRUMEO course if you're a part of that community. This documentary is literally one of the most comprehensive pieces of Phil that we have on tape. And it's incredible for that reason alone, that just having Phil talk for so long, the closest we have would be those, that kind of album by album commentary from Genesis back in the early 2000s that they released with the box sets. Those are all on YouTube, and those are my favorite pieces of content. The John Edgington stuff as well. Sorry, that's also there. That John Edgington would maybe be the most content documentary, the raw footage that he released. But this is the newest, right? It's 2 years old now, but it is the newest, which is very cool. Here, before I give you some little details, here's what I'll say is the best part. And here's what I say what was the saddest part, or just a very weird epiphany I had. The best part is the father-son relationship with Phil. And if I had to criticize this documentary, the fact is that it's hard to focus on. Do we focus on Phil, the iconic drummer, the fact that he's seen more as a 80s pop star, as a singer, as a songwriter, and not as a drummer? That's really the focus of the documentary. And that's great. And that's a story that should be told. And there's a lot of Tarzan people and a lot of Easy Lover fans who don't know that he is one of the most respected drummers in rock and roll history. Okay, so that's a story that needs to be told. The other story that needs to be told is there's that story plus the fact that he can't play drums, can't even hold a drumstick anymore, even though he does attempt a little bit, which was very adorable. But I think the story that that was, it's a secondary story. Is the relationship between Nick and Phil, and the fact that you have Nick, this phenomenal drummer, and there's home footage that we've never seen before of Nick and Phil, which is incredible. But I mean, there's something to that story and the fact that Nick played with Phil on 2 tours. They explore that a ton. That's my favorite part. And it's not really a criticism because there's just so many stories to tell in this documentary. I mean, they didn't even touch on the music of Phil. They didn't even talk about But Seriously. They didn't even talk about anything after But Seriously. Barely any talk of No Jacket Required, probably because that's not an album known for his drumming, other than maybe Take Me Home. So it wasn't a huge focus on the music. It was focused on drumming. But anyway, the relationship between Phil and Nick was, and just their interactions, I could watch that for hours. I mean, if they did a podcast together, that'd be awesome. But they won't. And you could tell from Nick and Brandon's perspective, it was a little bit of pulling teeth from Phil to talk about his history, talk about his music. Unlike Tony, who does go back a bit more, um, Phil is a lot like Peter, who doesn't go back in time and talk very much about his history. We've heard some of the similar stories of how In the Air Tonight was the drum fill came about, and how the gated reverb sound came about, and we've heard about how he started drums. But you know, Phil doesn't really want to go track by track and talk about certain songs unless it's something that he really, really loves. But you could tell that like Phil wasn't as excited to talk about his music as we are to hear about it. And this is the biggest takeaway for me that I felt to be weird and somewhat sad. And this is what I realized. I'm a bigger fan of Phil Collins' music than Phil Collins is. I know more about Genesis and Phil Collins than Phil Collins does. I know more about Genesis and Phil Collins than Nick Collins does. When you watch this documentary, there's things that they're talking about. They're asking questions. Did this happen? Was this the year? And I'm like realizing that like the role of being a super fan, a diehard fan, is kind of alienating because the person you're a fan of is somewhat unrelatable to you. You think that you have the ultimate thing in common, which is them, but they're not really interested in their own art. The realization that I've listened to Phil Collins and Genesis music probably 1,000 times more than Phil's ever listened to his own albums. There's no doubt in my mind. The little nuances, the little things that he did, most of it not intentional, that I would want to talk about, that I would want to ask questions about, that has really no interest to him. That was a massive epiphany that I had as a fan, and realizing like why it's kind of difficult to be a fan, but at the same time understanding that's why a YouTube channel like this exists. That's why our Facebook group, our Patreons, our YouTube, that's why um, these forums exist for us, because it's just us. It's just us who really cares about this stuff. That was kind of a weird, eye-opening experience where I'm like, I'm obsessed with all of this music. I could talk about this for hours. I could watch a Phil documentary for 24 hours straight. He doesn't seem very interested in his own music. Do you get what I'm saying? Is that weird? Okay, a couple other fun little tidbits, Timbits, Canadian reference. He's not fond of And Then There Were Three. I think we knew that. Nobody really is. I mean, the fans are. I've been warming to that album years and years, but he's not fond of that record. This documentary was missing Chester and Tony and Hugh. So no Tony Smith, no Chester Thompson, and no Hugh Padgham. That to me was weird. I'm sure they tried. But Daryl's on it. Brad Cole's not in it. That I don't think. Daryl's there, which is great. Louis Conti is there. I think Phil even said, just to go back to what I was saying, I think Phil even said, I'm not the biggest Genesis fan. That was funny. Another great moment was there was a picture of Phil wearing, from like the 70s, wearing a Genesis t-shirt behind the drums. You guys know what I'm referring to. Very common for indie rock bands to wear their band merch because they just run out of clothes on tour. But anyway, Nick said, would you ever be caught wearing a Genesis shirt today? It was a very, very funny moment. Another talk about What Gorilla. They talk a lot of deep cuts, which is great. How that started with drums, and then the music was written on top of the a part that he had used as for rehearsals, which is kind of cool. So there's little pieces of information that we learned there. Maybe that had been said before, but I'm not sure. If you haven't seen this documentary, you need to watch it. I watched it very quickly when it premiered to the DRUMEO members so that I could prepare for this video, but I definitely need to go back and watch it again. We are very fortunate, and a huge thank you to Brandon and the DRUMEO team and Nick Collins. I've said all along since we started talking about this, Nick's relationship with DRUMEO, as I do think that Nick is going to be a part of the legacy of Phil Collins. I hope he is. He's back on tour with Mike and the Mechanics soon, which is very cool. So I don't know what that looks like. Is he going to tour casinos and play the drums of Genesis into his 60s and 70s? I don't know. That's fine. But I hope that there's somebody out there who is a steward of the catalog. Now, I'm not sure if that's happening with Concord, and I'm not sure if there's unreleased material on hard drives somewhere, but I hope that someone like Nick does a little digging and takes over the legacy of Phil so that we can keep talking about Phil and listening to Phil for the next several decades. But this is a good start. It's a really good start to have some fresh stuff. And so I know you're watching this and you're thinking, well, this documentary is officially now 2 years old. This footage feels 2 years older. But you know what? That's just how long it took to make this great documentary. And it's completely a natural timeline, which I now realize. Anyway, I'm probably forgetting things and I'll watch it again, and I want you to watch it. I'll provide a link below. Please let me know in the comments if you have now watched the documentary, what you think of it. Was there anything new that you learned? What was some of the sweetest, most heartfelt moments that you saw? I think it's terrific to see Phil behind a drum kit and to hit a drum. Did he hit a drum? And then when he's like, that's enough of that. Incredible moment, absolutely iconic moment. For DRUMEO to catch that on camera is really special. So thanks to them for doing it. Thank you for watching this video, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts.